Namaskar. The absent site of memory, the Kanpur Memorial Well, and the 1957 centenary commemoration of the Indian Mutiny. In 1957, the city of Kanpur erected a statue to Tatya Tope on a blank sandstone circle in the center of the municipally owned Nana Rao Park. Tope was a hero of the 1957 rebellion, as was Nana Sahib Dondupant, after whom the park had been named. The erection of this Indian nationalist monument caused some consternation amongst the remaining British community within India, and an official complaint was made to both the national and regional authorities by the British High Commission in New Delhi. As a result, the monument was removed a dozen yards from this initial position, so that it merely overlooked the stone circle instead of standing at its center. The reason for the British complaint and the insistence that the Tope statue be removed was that when the park, which until 1948 had been maintained by a British trust, the Memorial Well Garden Society was transferred to the city authorities. The only condition was that nothing whatsoever could be built on the over the sandstone circle. Nana Rao Park had been until 1949 the Kanpur Memorial Gardens, and the sandstone circle at its center was all that was left of the Memorial Well Monument, one of the most venerated British shrines of the Raj, built on the site of the finest resting place of the approximately 125 women and children killed in the city on 15 July 1857. Yet, without prior knowledge, a visitor after 1949 would have had no inkling that the blank sandstone circle within this pleasant but otherwise nondescript park was once more often visited by Europeans in India than was the Taj Mahal. That Indian nationalists chose to erect their own monument to the 1857 mutiny on the centenary of those events are hardly surprising, but it was the British themselves who accomplished the removal of the original monument. In the Memorial Garden, some eight years before 1957, in a deliberate attempt to obliterate one of their most precious sites of resemblance, Lux de Memoire, Pierre and Nora argued in the context of the French nation that a variety of objects, places, and concepts have become the fixed, eternalized sites of what was once an eternalized social memory. The collapse of living collective memory and its replacement by the deliberate preservation of historical memory in specific memory sites, Nora and others suggest, is characteristic of modernity, and following Nora, many practitioners in the recent memory boom have tended to subject such sites of memory to rigorous analysis, examining them as self-referential signifiers. It is questionable, however, whether a memorial monument like that which stood at Kanpur from the early 1860s to the late 1940s can alone convey transparent expressions of intended or even accredited social and political meaning. Objects do not speak for themselves. Rather, the significance of a physical site of resemblance is based on how observers have perceived and interpreted the meaning of the object and transmitted that perception to others. If, as Nora suggests, particular site became become the locus of collective memory, then we should conceptualize that memory not as self-signifying but as the result of the interaction among three types of historical factors: the intellectual and cultural traditions that frame all our representations of the past, the memory makers who selectively adopt and manipulate these traditions, and the memory consumers who use, ignore, or transform such artifacts according to their own interests. This hermeneutical triangle, the dialogue between the object itself, its makers, and its consumers, can help us to appreciate the evolving meaning for the British of the Kanpur site in the second half of the 19th century. The significance of the removal of the actual monument immediately after Indian independence and the continuing anxieties among British officials and residents in independent India about the symbolism of the location even after the removal of all physical markers of the commemorated events from the site. The Bibighar massacre and the construction of remembrance in the Kanpur memorials. The mutiny began among the disaffected Indian infantry in early 1857, the spark for revolt being the introduction of new rifle cartridges that used animal fats for their lubrication. Detachments of the Bengal Army of the East India Company rose against their officers at Meerut in May, killing many and setting fire to the cantonment before marching on to Delhi, swearing loyalty to Bahadur Shah II, and a descendant of the last Mughal ruler, and declaring him King of Hindustan. Revolts against British rule followed throughout central and northern India, most significantly at Delhi, Lucknow, and Kanpur, but it did not spread to the armies of the presidencies of Madras or Bombay. The military revolt also unleashed widespread agrarian unrest, particularly in the recent annexed province of Awadh, but these popular struggles tended to remain localized and disparate, so that the events of 1857 to 1858 became something more than a sepoy mutiny, but something less than a national revolt. With the arrival of some 35,000 additional troops, the rebels were brutally suppressed. News accounts riveted public attention in Britain on the Indian uprising and the struggle to repress it, turning otherwise obscure British generals into household names. In Kanpur, British civilians, officers, and troops under the leadership of General Hugh Massey Wheeler took refuge in an unfinished barracks complex, hastily fortified and subsequently referred to as the entrenchment, besieged for weeks by several thousand sepoys led by Nana Sahib. Eventually, the British surrendered on 26 June on the promise of safe passage down to the Ganges to Allahabad on boats supplied by the rebels. However, while boarding the boats at the landing stage, the Sati Chaura Ghat, the British were ambushed by Nana Sahib's forces. All but 4 of the British men were killed, and some 125 women and children were captured and imprisoned in a house in the city known as the Bibighar, the House of the Ladies, only themselves to be killed and their bodies thrown into a well on 15 July. Though 2 days before Kanpur was relieved by a British force under General Henry Havelock. The massacres at Kanpur were for the British one of the signal events of the 1857 to 1858 revolt, central to framing the entire mutiny nation narrative in British official and popular accounts for the remainder of the century. As late as the 1890s, the American missionary William Butler could refer to the events at Kanpur as the blackest crime in human history, since every element of perfidy and cruelty was concentrated in it. No act ever carried to so many hearts such a thrill of horror as did the deed that was done there on 15th July 1857. The suffering of British women at Kanpur quickly became a mentorium mentorium for the century mentorium for the for the severity of the challenge to the British Empire in India. Subsequently, the events at Kanpur tended to be depicted through a gendered narrative in which Indian brutality to British women displaced the brutality of British colonial rule and the terrible reprisals exacted on those suspected of participation in the 1857 revolts. Consequently, even though twice as many children as women died at the Babyghar for the British, the event came to be known as the Massacre of the Ladies and the Slaughter in the House of the Ladies. Moreover, the nakedness of the corpses convinced those that discovered them that the women had been subjected to sexual humiliations, although there was never any actual evidence of this, as contemporaries quickly noted, and later official investigations found the likelihood of sexual assault remote. Still, innuendo and suggestive images of the fate of the prisoners in the Babyghar effectively raised popular outrage among both British troops and those reading news of the events back in Britain. The outrages against British women perpetrated at Kanpur thus confirmed British views of Indians as degraded savages and served as a rallying cry to the building of a renewed Christian militaristic masculinity. Faced with such apparent barbarism, the savagery of British reprisals was the more easily rationalized. Indeed, British vengeance appeared all the more virtuous in the face of the demonization and emasculation of the Indian. The events of 1857 to 1858 provoked substantial political and military reforms, the most significant being the replacement of the East India Company by a more formal colonial administration and the beefing of the British component of the armies in India. But the mutiny also had a powerful and lasting cultural legacy within both Britain and India. The mutiny became a touchstone in cultural representations of the British Raj until independence, aiding in the hardening of racial categories and increasing the symbolic distance between the British and their Indian subjects. Popular stories about the mutiny flowed liberally on the heels of the journalism, poetry, and memoirs of survivors and campaign participants. Tellingly, even serious general histories of India that did not dwell on the massacres at Kanpur nevertheless contained illustrations or photos of the memorial to the victims established at the Babyghar well site in the 1860s. More than 50 mutiny novels were published between 1858 and 1947, and a scandal erupted over mutiny paintings exhibited in London in 1858. In latter 19th century British school books, discussions of the Raj tended to revolve around the events of 1857, usually explaining the British presence in India within a symbolic narrative of Indian tragedy and British tragedy, symbolized by the well at Kanpur, heroic resistance against overwhelming odds demonstrated by the siege of Lucknow, and manly triumph and renewal, the climax of which was the recapture of Delhi, as Gautam Chakraborty has demonstrated a dominant interpretation of the meaning of the mutiny developed as the events unfolded, and with the exception of a few dissenting voices, lasted for a century after 1857. This dominant interpretation was neither systematic nor conspiratorial, but rather a network of plots, redactions, myths, politics, and cultures that coalesced quickly around a number of core images, key among them those of British women as the helpless victims of mutiny violence, which stemmed from the events at Kanpur. The process of commemorating the massacre and the political manipulation of the martyrs began as soon as Havelock's relieving forces discovered the Kanpur site on 16th July 1857. The Vivighar was searched for any inscriptions from the victims about the events, and when none could be found, British troops provided their own impromptu imagined memorials in the form of graffiti. Your wives and children are here in misery and at the disposal of savages. My child, think of us, avenge us, countrymen and women. Remember the 15th of July 1857. Your wives and families are here in misery and at the disposal of savages who has ravished both young and old and then killed. Oh, my child, countrymen, revenge it. Remember, Kanpur was also scrawled on the walls in numerous places and became the de facto battle cry for the British during the remainder of the campaign to suppress the rebellion. This re-inscription of the site of the massacre by the troops that found the gruesome well, and which was located in the countryside of the Bibighar, encouraged subsequent British soldiers to carry out without pause the brutal retaliation and punishments ordered by Bibighar Brigadier General James Neil and other British commanders. These reprisals included Neil's famous strange law of 25 July that decreed that the blood and gore of the Vivighar would hereafter be cleaned by Indian prisoners before execution in a manner made as revolting to Indian feelings as possible. Lieutenant Arthur Lang wrote of this reaction to the site in a letter home. No one who has seen that sport can ever feel anything but deep hatred to Nana and his fellow friends and all his fellow friends and all his fellow race. No officer standing in those rooms spoke to another, though each knew his neighbor's feeling. I know I could not have spoken. I felt as if my heart was stone and my brain fire, and that the spot was enough to drive one mad. Neil made his high caste Brahmin and Musliman sepoy prisoners lick the stains on the floor and wall before he hung them. The gallows on which he hung them is the only pleasant thing in the compound on which to rest the eye. All these friends will never be repaid 1/10 of what they deserve. Such attitudes were clearly common among the British within India. When Deputy Commissioner of the Punjab, Francis Cooper, summarily executed on nearly 500 unarmed mutineers at Ujnala on 1 July 1857. He justified his actions by exclaiming, "There is a well at Kanpur, but there is also now one at Ujnala." The Vivekar was the first focus of commemoration, but attention soon switched to the well in which the massacred bodies had been deposited. For reasons of hygiene, Havelock and Neil decided not to disinter the bodies, but rather filled the whole site with lime and consecrated it as a single grave. As a poignant marker, soldiers placed the discarded clothing of the women and children onto the resulting mound, although later observers mistook these garments for the cadavers themselves. Moreover, since the onset of monsoon rains later in the year resulted in the erosion of the earth around the corpses, it was decided to break over the wellhead completely. A small monument in the shape of a cross was then erected in front of the well by some troops, inscribed with the words, "I believe in the resurrection of the body," and the Vivekar itself was razed to the ground when Lord Canning, the newly proclaimed first Viceroy from 1858 to 1862, passed through Kanpur for his darbar. All the land around the well was cleared of the remaining partially destroyed structures. When Canning returned to Kanpur in 1861, he had decided to commission a permanent memorial to be placed on the well head. The general layout of the memorial, a Gothic stone screen surrounding a sculpture with the whole memorial enclosed by a fenced garden, was sketched out by Charlotte Lady Canning, who had known many of the victims of massacre personally and was moved to honor their memory in perpetuity. In the gardens, which originally encompassed some 60 acres, were designed by the collector at Kanpur. A fine on the Indian inhabitants of Kanpur was levied for their failure to resist Nana Sahib's insurrection, and the resulting monies amounting to some pound 30,000 were used for the landscaping of the gardens. In February 1863, the memorial gardens were opened by Canning's successor as Viceroy, Lord Elgin, from 1862 to 1863. On the completion of the Gothic screen at the Kanpur, at the center of the park, designed by Colonel Henry Yule of the Bengal Engineers. Thereafter, a British soldier stood on guard in the garden at all times right up to 1947. British visitors were required to maintain a somber and dignified demeanor. Carriages limited to footpace for example, and entry to the gardens was allowed to Indian residents of Kanpur only with a special pass, but they were never permitted inside the Gothic screen. While the building of the memorial gardens was quickly decided and accomplished, the shrine to the martyrs of the Raj, the memorial statue to be placed within the Gothic screen on the well head itself proved to be a greater challenge, particularly with regard to the issue of the appropriate iconography. Numerous Demands were voiced in the Times for a worthy monument to the British dead. One sculptor one sculptor proposed the figures of dead children lying at the feet of an English woman leaning on a cross pierced with a sword. This was too graphic for the Canning. This was too graphic for the Cannings, who wanted to avoid depicting the horrors of 1857 and argued that this vision of murder and terror is not the monument to be perpetuated, but rather the condition of sober mournfulness. The Cannings were instead moved by the design of Baron Carlo Marochetti, who proposed a downcast marble angel standing before a cross, palm fronts on its crossed arms, a design very similar to his angel guarding the monument to the Crimean War dead at Scutari. The inscription around the base of his statue, which he entitled "The Angel of the Resurrection," stated, "Sacred to the perpetual memory of a great company of Christian people, chiefly women and children, cruelly massacred near this spot by the rebel Nana Sahib and thrown the dying with the dead into the well beneath on the 15th day of July, MDCCCL7. Given the commission, Marochetti executed his statue and had it shipped to Kanpur, whereupon it was placed on a pedestal over the wellhead and surrounded by the Gothic screen. The Cannings paid for the statue out of their own funds, but both were dead. Lady Canning died in 1861, Lord Canning in 1862, before its completion in 1865. Once the whole shrine was completed, visitors would trek to the center of the gardens, walk up a grassy knoll to use a screen and pass into the sacred site through a heavy wrought iron gate over which were the words of Pajm, P-S-A-L-M, Pajm. Our bones are scattered at the grave's mouth, as when one cutteth and cleaveth wood upon the earth. The Cannings proposed a second major monument at Kanpur to be funded by public subscription. This took the form of a church over the site of British state from the siege of Wheeler's entrenchment. This large Romanesque-style Anglican church was renamed All Souls, and its interior walls were covered with plaques honoring the regiments and men and women of the 1857 garrison. The Bishop of Calcutta consecrated the church upon its completion in 1875. Both the Angel in the Memorial Garden and All Souls Church were infused with obvious Christian symbolism, and they soon became the focus of pilgrimage, but most particularly the memorial well. The Kanpur site were frequently visited from the 1860s until the interwar years. Generally, these visits can be divided up into official tours by royal and vice-regal figures, pilgrimages by the members of the British Indian community within the subcontinent, and tourism by British and foreign visitors. In all three cases, the aim of visiting the memorials and what significance was taken away by visitors were informed by the pre-existing mutiny narrative. In short, visitors brought to the memorials the meaning they intended to find there. Vice-regal tours of Indian territory had been established by Canning and became a staple of the elaborate rituals of British ornamentalism that were designed to impart symbolically British imperial authority. The British imperial authority, the 18 sorry British imperial authority, the 1875 tour by the Prince of Wales, for instance, followed what had by then become the standard official pilgrimage route to the mutiny site of Lucknow, Kanpur and Delhi. When he arrived at Kanpur, the prince immediately visited All Souls Memorial Church and then the Memorial Gardens, reading the touching words of the inscription aloud in a low voice while his retinue 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 remained solemnly silent. The prince instructed his empire retinue not to leave until they had seen that which they had come to look for, the well-head statue. The Viceroy Lord Lytton from 1876 to 1880 followed in the steps of the prince and toured Kanpur's memorials on the 20th anniversary of the mutiny, finding them all appropriately solemn. His wife Edith recorded in her diary, "Such a pretty, fresh, peaceful spot. One can hardly realize the agonies experienced there." Lytton's successor as Viceroy, the Marquis of Ripon from 1880 to 1884, visited the memorials in the summer of 1880, and another royal tour took place in 1905, in which the Prince and Princess of Wales paid homage to the victims of the mutiny. Official visits such as these affirmed that the monuments had become significant symbolic sites of memory for the Raj as a whole. The recorded impressions of official visitors indicated that the angel statue on the wellhead had become established as the most significant symbolic marker of the Kanpur events. The Marchioness and Marquess of Dufferin, the latter served as Viceroy from 1884 to 1888, made their visit as part of their Jubilee tour of 1887. For the Marchioness, the monument in the Memorial Gardens was the saddest spot of all. The well has been filled in and is surrounded by an ornamental wall, inside of which in the center stands a white marble figure of an angel. She leans against a cross and had long wings touching the ground. Her arms are crossed and she holds a palm branch in each hand. We did not think her face quite beautiful enough, but the whole suggests sort of silence and solemnity, and so far is successful. No native is ever allowed to enter this enclosure, and they have to get passage to come into the garden. It is very well kept and is full of roses and flowering shrubs. Significantly, as with other late 19th century observers, the racial exclusivity of the site was recorded in a purely matter-of-fact manner, or justified on the basis that it was a sacred spot for the British. When Curzon was Viceroy from 1899 to 1905, reached India in the autumn of 1899, he made a point of visiting Kanpur with his wife, an experience which left them deeply moved. They were in no doubt about the exclusivity of the site. Descriptions of visits to the memorials by the members of the British community within India tended to be made using the language of personal or familial pilgrimage. For such visitors, the monuments aroused feelings of burning indignations, indig- indignation of fresh personal sorrow, and brought home how brutally, shudderingly real the events had been. A member of the Indian Civil Service found visiting Kanpur in 1881 made the events of 1857 memorable to the painfully memorable to him. He felt sorry. A member of the Indian Civil Service found visiting Kanpur in 1881 made the events of 1857 painfully memorable to him. He felt compelled to visit the sites again in 1889. The photo albums of many British Indians contained pictures or postcards of the memorial well. Andrew Ward relates finding one from William Lindsay to his niece in 1983 with his simple handwritten message, "Remember Kanpur on the reverse." Indeed, ritualized remembering of the mutiny by the British Indian community, especially in gardened terms, underpinned later justifications for the use of violence to keep order within the Raj. By the early 20th century, as Procida notes, British women in India foregrounded the spectre of the mutiny and of mutiny violence in many of their writings and in their vocal support of General Dyer after the British massacre of unarmed Indian protesters at Amritsar in 1919. British Indian women petitioned in support of Dyer and defended his actions in the press and in fiction, drawing explicit connections between the events at Kanpur and what Dyer's drastic actions might have prevented. The parallels were made stark by the collective punishment meted out by Dyer in response to the beating and suspected, although unsubstantiated, rape of a British missionary, Miss Sherwood, in the immediate aftermath of the Amritsar massacre. Here were clear echoes of the events of Kanpur and the need for a vigorous response. Neil in 1857 had humiliated suspected mutineers on their hands and knees in the Bibighar in 1919. Dyer ordered all Indian men passing the street where Miss Sherwood had been assaulted to get on their hands and knees and crawl. In both cases, British collective punishments were justified with reference to the suffering of British women. Significantly, however, as Procida convincingly demonstrates, the public support British Indian women demonstrated for Dyer indicated their position of continued commitment to the empire through violence if need be. This was the lesson of the mutiny and the events of Kanpur for many British women. Writing in the 1930s, one British Indian, Alice Lothar, summed up the importance of actively remembering 1857, remembering what the British community in 1857 endured. It is unbelievable to me how anyone can breathe even in secret. Let us abandon India. The nationalist challenge for the interwar years was thus for many within the British Indian community met with a call to remember the greater challenges faced in the past and here A memorial well at Kanpur served as one of the most important sites of keeping the memory of challenges faced, martyrdoms made and sacrifice avenged. Visiting the memorial sites also became popular among tourists to India from the 1880s. The Times noted in 1880 that no European traveller passes the neighbourhood of Kanpur without making a pilgrimage to the solemn spot from which he looks back into that terrible past. Touring the mutiny site was made possible by the East India Railway line that connected Lucknow with Kanpur in the early 1860s, a construction project partly designed to help speed troops to potential trouble spots, while a feature of many tourist itineraries. Visitors to Kanpur generally only stayed in the city long enough to visit the memorial sites, all of which could easily be seen in 2 to 3 hours after visiting the mutiny sites. After visiting the mutiny cities himself. Thomas Cook commissioned guidebooks and arranged tours to northern India that paid special attention to the memorial sites. Significantly, these visitors' guidebooks and official gazettes, prepared first by the Director General of Statistics to the Government of India and then by the Secretary of State for India in Council, relied heavily on the early histories of the mutiny for their content, and in turn later popular histories cited the guidebooks and gazettes as peer authorities, thereby perpetuating the mutiny narrative as the framework for understanding the site. As Goswami notes, following declarative such as Goswami notes, following such guidebooks thus turned the uncertainties of history into discrete readable spaces, and unlike at Lucknow, where the ruined residency had itself been preserved as memorial to the heroism of the defenders, the guidebooks explained that at Kanpur there are no buildings to visit, the sole interest attaching to the place being the frightful massacre which took place during the mutiny. Published accounts of visits to the sites similarly infused travel description with the mutiny narrative. Then we drove about a mile away to the deep ravine called the Suti Chora Ghat. Here were the very steps shaded by the same people tree where the men, women and children went down on their way to embark from the ghat on the river. They had surrendered to Nana Sahib and will be remembered on the condition of being transported in boats up the Ganges to Allahabad. The women and children had embarked in the open boats and been pushed into the middle of the stream. The stone platform, flanked by 2 archways, was crowded with others. There was a cry of treachery, and the soldiers of Nana Sahib, acting under his orders, opened fire. Volley after volley was fired upon the helpless occupants of each boat, a hidden battery of guns behind a tree being brought to bear upon those on the landing stage. It became a wholesale butchery. The women and children The women and children who were captured and not massacred were taken that night to the assembly rooms. Here atrocities were committed, such as even the passage of even the page of history cannot detail until a century has passed and the victims and their near relations shall be laid to rest. Some cannot ever be mentioned in the ears of ladies, but the word learnt then if it never learnt before. What our sex can endure. One lady killed the native with his own sword when he attempted with Nana's permission to take her away to his house. Thus they remained for upwards for a fortnight. When at Havelock approached, Nana Sahib ordered a general massacre at the assembly rooms, the house of massacre as it came to be called. The bodies were cast into a well. It is on this awful spot that the most perfect monument full of beauty and peace has been so swiftly erected, the lovely statue of Maro Chetty. This fusion of mutiny narrative with travelogue continued well into the 20th century and was incorporated into the accounts of non-British tourists, such as American biographer Agnes Rushburgh, who in 1929 opined the chief interest of Kanpur for the average tourist is its mutiny history. The events that happened here were far more tragic than those at Lucknow, and one feels like saying far more sublime in courage than self-sacrifice. For over 50 years, tourists visited the sites on practically a daily basis. They came from many lands, but with sad thoughts and respectful steps approached the Ladies' Monument. The exact number of such tourists is unknowable, and few left detailed. Sorry. The exact number of such tourists is unknowable, and few left detailed public collections of their experience. Indeed, some were reticent about putting their emotions into words, though a few published accounts do indicate the impact of the visit significantly, as the memorial attracted more and more tourists. Those who wrote about visiting tended to record their own impression of the angel statue as much as express sadness and rehearse the details of the events commemorated, though some did both. No doubt tourists came to the site because of some prior knowledge of the mutiny narrative. Why else would they be visiting what was a obscure industry city, often noted for its poor visitor accommodation and general lack of beauty or interest? But once at the sites, they did what tourists do when visiting locations, the content of which is already known to them. They passed judgment and demonstrated their aesthetic taste. After noting the importance of the site for tourists, at times correspondent in 1876 proclaimed, "It is worth notice that no two people agree exactly as to the expression of Marochetti's angel, is it pain, pity, resignation, vengeance, or trump?" The gardens themselves were reported as lovely and beautifully kept and worthy of every mournful memory from this loveliest and saddest of all spots on earth. But the angel statue was vigorously depicted in travelers' accounts as full of tender sorrow, as beautiful and executively sorry execu- ex- as 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 beautiful and executively simple as it can be, and as emblematical of martyrdom and victory. The experience of visiting the site carefully was deep moving to some visitors. One cannot get rid of a sad feeling about the palace, about the place, and many reported breaking into tears or standing reverently before the monument. In 1905, one party had to leave the city immediately after visiting the memorial. So moved were they by the painful memories evoked by our pilgrimage. Frederick Wyman's response soon after the memorial had been erected had been more mixed, leaving him with mingled feelings of regret and thankfulness. Regret that the deed had been so feebly avenged, but thankfulness that it still blessed God to bless our arms. Another observer pointed to the possibility that visiting the site helped deal with such painful memories of the events. One thinks of Kanpur with a shudder and leaves it with a shy, but the power of the mutiny narrative in conditioning responses of those visiting the site over time can be seen in the reporting of American photographer James Riccarton, who wrote in 1889, "If I were asked to name the saddest spot and most pathetic spot in the entire world, I would say that over which the pure and brooding angel stands." Critical appreciations of the memorial focused on what the art did or did not accomplish rather than questioned the world historical importance of the site. Thus, the theosophist H.P. Blavatsky, while not a supporter of British imperialism, on visiting the site in the mid-1880s, nonetheless concentrated his comments on the failure of the architecture appropriately to commemorate the great tragic event. The statue represents a quartz figure of an angel with his sick hands held upon palms down as though he felt cold and was warming them at an open fireplace. The statue is the work of Baron Carlo Marochetti and represents, according to his idea, the angel of compassion. But why this pose should represent compassion and not something else is hard to say. The statue is placed within a granite enclosure with an iron railing around it. In front, marble steps lead to a wicket gate in the railing. This is even more ridiculous, as it would seem that in a structure having no roof, a gate had no place, the more so as it seems to be hanging between heaven and earth. By the turn of the 20th century, some responses to visiting the statue were being put into the context of the future of the British within India. Some visitors were clearly critical of the symbolic context of the monuments. Beatrice and Sydney Webb made the requisite pilgrimage to the mutiny sites in 1912 and noted no Indians are allowed to enter the beautiful ornamental gardens which are kept out of public taxation. This dates from the mutiny days and is really an invidious piece of vengeful feeling. The soldier on duty defended the exclusion on the ground that if Indians were admitted, they would picnic all over the grounds and make a mess. But this is a mere excuse. The clerk at the Bank of Bengal, to whom we mentioned the matter, said that he thought the continuance of an invidious race exclusion was a mistake. Others criticized the Memorial Gardens not for its racial exclusivity or its extended purpose, but for its excessive solemnity. In his handbook to Allahabad, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Banaras, 1896, Henry George Keeney explained, "The garden is well laid out, but it is much too large for the enclosure of a tomb. The necessary observances of a crematory tended cremate sorry the necessary observances of a cemetery rendered this large and ornamental piece of ground useless for the ordinary purposes of a public garden, even though the monument is not visible from any but the most central position. Even when its architectural form, Solomon demeanor or racial exclusivity was criticized. However, there was no doubt of the symbolic importance vested in the memorial site by the British well into the mid-20th century. Tellingly, even serious late 19th and early 20th century general histories of India that passed over the events of 1857 in Kanpur without comment nevertheless contained illustrations or photographs of the memorial sculpture. Moreover, at and even after Indian independence, the site's commemorative function and the particular cast of the mutiny's narrative that Moreover, at and even after Indian independence, the site's commemorative function and the particular cast of the mutiny narrative that framed that function played on the anxieties of British officials and observers. Indian independence, the memorial well, and the 1957 mutiny centenary. At India's independence in August 1947, one of the outstanding issues between the United Kingdom and the sovereign government of India was what would be done to protect and preserve the approximately 1.5 million British graves and thousands of memorials, monuments, statues, and portraits left behind by the British. The Commonwealth Relations Office in London worried about the domestic political consequences of simply abandoning this mass of commemorative culture, monuments, and buildings connected with the events of 1857 were especially likely to rouse a good deal of strong and natural sentiment in this country, Britain, and it is desirable to do what we can to protect them. On the other hand, we cannot expect Indians to exert themselves and incur expenditure in maintaining them, and indeed their existence may be resented by many Indians. This resentment was geographically displayed by the attack on the Kanpur Memorial well on the day of independence, 15 August 1947, when an Indian mob scaled the garden walls, blackened the face of monument's angel, broke its hands, and desecrated some of the graves that dotted the gardens. Although the government of the state of Uttar Pradesh, formerly the United Provinces, where Kanpur is situated, immediately apologized for the desecration and repaired the damage. The memorial well's future and that of all India's British memorials and monuments became the subject of anxious consideration by the British High Commission in New Delhi, and of protected correspondence between the High Commission and officials and interested interested lay observers in Britain. The British High Commissioner Sir Terence Shone from 1947 to 1948 charged British Brigadier Humphrey Bullock with surveying and registering a complete list of all British monuments, memorials and graves within India for the newly created British Monuments and Graves section of the High Commission. This agency, along with the Indian Office of the Imperial War Graves Commission, whose remit was strictly cemeteries containing military graves, was established in December 1947 and was charged with the maintenance and supervision of British cemeteries and monuments within India, because the annual cost of upkeep of all the locations charted was seen as prohibitively expensive. Prior to independence, more than $45,000 had been spent annually on just the largest and most prominent sites, and the appeal for charitable donations failed to raise substantial funds. There was little political will to ask the UK taxpayer to foot the bill in perpetuity, and contingency plans had to be drawn up. In Bullock's opinion, monuments of the British period, like monuments of the Mughal period, were essentially monuments and evidence of the history of the dominions of India and Pakistan. They should therefore be preserved as relics of that history by the new post-colonial states. However, as Bullock reported to the British High Commissioner in December 1947, the actual alternatives open to the British with regard to the mass of memorials were limited. The removal of monuments and memorials to the United Kingdom, except in isolated instances, is not a practicable solution. Expense alone will rule out any mass movement of this nature. Further, generally speaking, it would be no easier to find a place in England for memorials than it would be in India. One must not, however, exclude the possibility of a special depository being established in the United Kingdom for memorials and monuments from India. The first course of action was, therefore, an effort to convince the Indian and Pakistani governments to take over the care of British monuments themselves. Bullock drew up a document explaining the British position, and meetings were arranged between the High Commissioner and the Indian Prime Minister. As Bullock explained in his memorandum, our approach to this difficult subject might be based on the following considerations. Since 15 August 1947, an Indian to be anti-British has ceased to have any practical, political or logical weight. The British rule has gone for good. It would seem to follow that agitation, abhorrence and or indifference towards British monuments merely on the ground that they perpetuate the shameful memory of foreign rule would be ill-founded. To urge on such grounds that they should be removed or demolished would be no more sensible than to propose the Taj Mahal be blown up because it is a monument of a Mughal ruler. Bullock did recognize, however, that many of the men in power had been anti-British all their political lives, and it cannot be expected that their outlook will undergo a sudden change by virtue of the operation of the Indian Independence Act. Still, the High Commission was urged to express to the new government of India that there is nothing derogatory to the Indian dignity or nationhood in their continuing to preserve and maintain all important memorials of British rule in the same way as those of Mughal and other former foreign ruler in their land. He admitted that some tactile inscriptions may require alteration or effacement, but noted that as a matter of fact the wording of inscriptions on mutiny monuments and graves in Lucknow, Kanpur and Delhi display in general a degree of moderation which is remarkable in view of the high feeling which existed amongst English people at the time of their election. This seems to be evidence of both the continuing influence of the mutiny narrative on Bullock himself and of psychological denial about the new realities of post-Braj South Asia, and this despite the realization in Whitehall and Delhi that British monuments in the subcontinent were at risk. After a series of discussions, the Government of India graciously agreed that it would treat the vast majority of British monuments with the same dignity and respect as it treated others from Indian history, but that it would not provide funds for their upkeep. Moreover, it reserved the right to ask the British government to repatriate or otherwise allow the Indian government to move any monuments liable to cause offence to Indian sensibilities, and in turn London asked that such changes as were inevitable should be made as unobtrusively as possible. In Whitehall, this informal undertaking was received first with some relief and then with the realization that the remaining monuments still constituted a sizable financial and potentially a symbolic problem. It was agreed within the Commonwealth Relations Office (CRO) that the best policy with regard to the plight of British monuments was to keep things quiet, especially within Britain, lest the proposed action by either Dominion government would damage British prestige. The problem of the cost of upkeep was then turned over to the High Commission in Delhi and to the management of Brigadier Bullock, whose solution was to transfer the care of as many cemeteries and memorials as possible to the precincts of Christian churches in India. He noted that by the end of July 1948, 300 local committees, some of them one-man affairs, had been set up in India and Pakistan and were dealing with over 1400 cemeteries, some of which were no more than isolated graves or small groups of graves, and to arrange the moving of small but important busts and statues to the grounds of the British High Commission regional offices. Graves that could not be identified or which were in areas without a local community to maintain them were allowed to return to nature. Bullock provided detailed instructions on how inscriptions should be transcribed or placements of monuments recorded whenever monuments were removed. He consulted with the resident European community and church officials on how they ought to establish memorial maintenance committees and raise funds from Britain and from the local European community for their upkeep. A large-scale moving of headstones, small memorials and monuments were thereafter undertaken. More prominent statues and monuments were left where they were. Their maintenance was either left to the whims of local Indian authorities or to funds contributed by the local European community, or especially in the case of military monuments, they were provided with endowments from current and former members of those regiments. A few memorials, however, like the Kanpur Memorial, presented more serious difficulties. Brigadier Bullock argued that this site was too expensive to British sentiment to be left to nature, but it was also found to be prohibitively expensive for the local community to protect the monument and gardens from future defacement. In October 1947, it was suggested that the gardens be given to the Uttar Pradesh government on condition that the local Memorial Well Gardens Society be allowed to maintain the actual well site. The Lucknow Diocesan Trust and the Bishop of Lucknow wanted the British High Commission to take over care of the monument by the end of 1948. However, Bullock decided, after further consultation with the British Indian community, ecclesiastical authorities and Uttar Pradesh officials, that the best course of action was to have the Gothic screen angel and assorted tombstones moved to the churchyard of All Souls Memorial Church in Kanpur. Fear of possible future desecration of the site was uppermost in Bullock's thinking here. All concerned were afraid that the memorial might again become a focus of extremist feeling, while it was thought unlikely that All Souls Memorial Church itself would become a target for iconoclasts. Fortunately, the British was endowed with enough funds to provide for the moving and upkeep of the statue. In 1949, then the entire well site within the gardens was levelled. The Bishop of Lucknow's advisor used the term obliterated in order to leave no trace of its former significance. Bullock's idea was to destroy the identity of the site so completely that no future visitor would be able to say where the well had been. This was done under the cover of darkness, and as there was no question of exhumation after the leveling, a simple tablet was laid indicating that the site was for former Christian burial ground, with no mention of the well itself or of its former significance. This latter step was taken so that nothing would be later built on the site. As Bullock noted, it is hallowed ground to all British and indeed all Christian people, and even the slightest possibility of a secular building, not to say Hindu temple or a mosque, being erected over it is abhorrent. The gardens were then donated to the city of Kanpur. The transfer indeed indicating that the sole condition of the transfer was that nothing should ever be built on the site in future. Kanpur resident Joe Yalland and art historian Mary Ann Steggles have suggested that the moving of the memorial and the effacement of the Bibighar well site demonstrated the maturity of the British at Indian independence. This is, however, a rather optimistic, perhaps even a naive conclusion. It disregards the fervid discussions between London and officials at the High Commission in New Delhi on how to preserve British imperial memory and honor from nationalist renaming and Iconoclasm, a report about the future of the memory well, compiled by Colonel C.J. Twain for the British High Commission in September 1947, was explicit about British fears that nationalists, perhaps even the Congress Party itself, would seek to publicly demolish the memorial, as it serves, in the opinion of the Congress Party, to perpetuate racial hatred. An offer by the Uttar Pradesh government to take over the memorial grounds and a promise of future maintenance of the monument so long as the restrictions on access were removed was viewed with some skepticism by Twainage and others who worried about the future disposition of the monuments. Indeed, former government of the United Provinces from 1945 to 1947, Sir Francis Wiley wrote to Sir Paul Patrick at the British High Commission in February 1948, warning that the gardens had been placed in the trust of the Well Garden Society in 1920 simply and solely to keep the provincial government out, so that the memorial would always remain in the hands of those who cared about it most, the British Indian community. Still, the restrictions on access to the gardens were lifted on Indian independence, and the gardens were formally transferred to the Uttar Pradesh government the following month. Care of monument, however, remained in the hands of the Memorial Well Garden Society, with the Uttar Pradesh government providing an armed guard. But as noted above, the problem of the well remained under discussion throughout 1948 until it was finally decided to entirely efface the site. The levelling of the site actually occurred in January 1949, thereby reuniting the gardens and site of the memorial as one park in the hands of the Uttar Pradesh government, and was accomplished with the aim of raising as little publicity about the action as possible. This was, however, There was, however, considerable debate among the remaining European population in India about the disposition of cemeteries and monuments, with a long-running debate in the Statesman New Delhi about the appropriateness of moving monuments or allowing burial grounds to return to nature. From both India and Britain, advocates of preserving British imperial monuments in situ also pressed the Commonwealth Relations Office, while the desire to protect cemeteries and monuments marking graves from desecration was reasonably rationalized at the time. There was an element of petulance in some of these British actions, especially with regard to the disposition of mutiny monuments. The decision to remove the memorial well and place the statuary in All Souls Church was explicit in its aim of denying to Indian nationalists any opportunity to use the site for their own political purposes, although it also revealed an idealistic notion that the church itself was safe so long as there was a Christian community, whether Britain or Indian. In Kanpur, Bullock and the High Commission followed closely the Uttar Pradesh Assembly debates over the Kanpur Well's authenticity and overturning British memorials into Indian public places. Sentiments such as the Premier G.B. Pant said it was Statements such as the Premier G.B. Pant said it was true that some historians had disproved the British assertion that this well was filled with their dead, raised concerns that Indian division of the British narrative of the mutiny might come to be attached to the site, and the decision to efface the site of the well thus needs to be put in the context of other British decisions concerning their monuments at the time of Indian independence at Lucknow. For instance, a British flag had flown on the pole of the ruined residence day and night since 1857. At Lucknow, for instance, a British flag had flown on the pole of the ruined residence day and night since 1857, a proud symbol of British defiance at the transfer of power in 1947. British sappers not only lowered the flag but also cut down the flagstaff and cemented over the base so that no other emblem could ever fly over the building. These actions suggest that the hold of the mutiny narrative had not yet dissipated among old Indian hands even at the moment of official withdrawal. In fact, the effacement of the Kanpur well site can reasonably be seen as an attempt to prevent the authentic site of memory being sullied or desecrated by interpretation and by In fact, the effacement of the Kanpur well site can reasonably be seen as an attempt to prevent the authentic site of memory being sullied or desecrated by reinterpretation and appropriation by Indians once the British could no longer afford its upkeep. Note with us understanding the continuous stream of letters from British citizens asking about the whereabouts of their ancestors' graves, the location and size or potential disposition of moved memorials or regimental monuments. Bullock's efforts dampened official concerns about the status of British monuments in India until late in 1955. There were some hostile letters and questions in the British House of Commons about the policy of allowing smaller cemeteries to return to nature and about the desecration of some unguarded sites, but these were brushed off on the grounds of financial necessity. Moreover, where possible, Bullock resisted the efforts of British residents and more often those of regiments to make a fuss about any monuments connected to the mutiny by suggesting that such attention imperiled them. For instance, he advised the regimental office of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in 1948. You will realize that the change of regime in this country has made it altogether inadvisable to conduct any public ceremony in connection with a memorial of the Indian Mutiny. In fact, I may say that the probable result of conducting such a ceremony with attendant publicity would be to invite the sabotage of the monument within a very short space of time. Yet official anxiety about the status of British monuments in India developed again at the centenary anniversary of the 1857 rebellion approached, particularly among the Commonwealth Relations Office and the British High Commissioners in Delhi and Karachi. Whitehall instructed all the British High Commissioners in South Asia to ask the various concerned governments how they proposed to commemorate the 1857 uprising. The High Commissioner to India, Malcolm MacDonald, from 1955 to 1960 was recalled to London to discuss the situation. After meeting with Dr. Radhakrishnan, the Indian Vice President at the time, MacDonald reported that he had gained assurances that the mutiny centenary would be celebrated not in May but in combination with the 10-year anniversary of independence in August, and that it would be an occasion for friendliness between the British and Indians rather than the reverse. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru moved to conjoin the two anniversaries with the aim of avoiding partisan political violence over the issue of former British rule, especially from leftist parties within India, all of which had objected to Nehru's decision to keep India within the Commonwealth. The Indian government did not intend to remove British monuments or build its own commemorative statues or buildings for the centenary. There would, however, be the presentation to the President of Dr. S.K. Singh's official new official history of the uprising. Still, Indian MPs continued to press the Indian government to change the names of roads and rid the landscape, particularly that of the capital New Delhi, of all remaining colonial icons. The visual examples. The visual examples of our former humiliation. In May 1957, Nehru spoke on the issue to the Lok Sabha, the Indian Parliament's House of the People. There are various kinds of statues. Some may be considered historical, some may be considered artistic, and some may be considered rather offensive in themselves and of various types. Our general attitude has been first of all to remove such as might be considered offensive, and that too gradually, without making too much fuss and without doing anything to raise ill will between countries. We have removed some of those statues and we propose to continue doing that. There are those which have been historically significant without causing offense. We shall also remove them and put them in historic museums. There, there are those that are not important historically or artistically. I do not know what we will do with them. If somebody else wants them, we will make a present of them. In particular, regarding such statues as may be considered in a sense offensive to our national sentiment, we have taken them up, and we do propose to take them up, but we wish to do all then this in a manner so as not to create international ill will and raise up old questions which are dead and gone. Despite these assurances, the remaining British community in India expressed concern to both the High Commission and to London about the likely character of the commemoration events, worrying that state and local governments do not necessarily follow the lead of the Government of India. Articles and letters in local newspapers calling for the destruction of all traces of the British past indicated the possibility of more violence to British monuments or even to British subjects. The Bishop of Lucknow worried that churches containing memorials of the mutiny might be attacked. Individuals within the British community were anxious about the potential dilemma of being invited to Indian centenary celebration. So in short, would a refusal to attend be considered as much of an insult as it would be embarrassing for them actually to participate? The anxiety within the anxiety with these officials within the British government also regarded the upcoming centenary was made apparently in early February of 1957, when the CRO went so far as to instruct the War Office to avoid domestic British regimental celebrations that might sorry The anxiety with which officials within the British government also regarded the upcoming news centenary was made apparent in early February of 1957 when the CRO went so far as to instruct the War Office to avoid domestic British regimental celebrations that might inflame Indian nationalist opinion. As Secretary of State for the Dominions, Lord Home explained to John Harley at the War Office. The anxiety with which officials within the British government also regarded the upcoming centenary was made apparent in early February of 1957 when the CRO went so far as to instruct the War Office to avoid domestic British regimental celebrations that might inflame Indian nationalist opinion. As Secretary of State for the Dominions, Lord Home explained to John Harley at the War Office, for political reasons, we should prefer to call all commemorations by the name the Sepoy Mutiny rather than the Indian Mutiny. While while he while he appreciated that British regiments had a very natural desire to celebrate the bravery of their predecessors, celebrations should be played down as much as possible in a handwritten postscript reflecting on the post-Suez crisis political situation and the desire to keep India officially friendly. He added ruefully, we are a bit touchy in the Commonwealth these days. Numerous regiments did in fact hold centenary ceremonies. Many British newspapers ran stories about the mutiny in May of 1957. The tone of most of which was muted. They did not refer to the events of 1857 to 1858 as a nationalist uprising. As if they did, it was only to say that this was a minority Indian view in India, despite the stream of anxious correspondence between the CRO and the UK High Commissioners about a feared orgy of monument smashing. MacDonald reported back to the CRO and to Prime Minister Macmillan in October that the actual anniversary events had proved to be somewhat of an anticlimax. A bitterly anti-British speech had been broadcast by the Indian President Dr. Rajendra Prasad, which the High Commissioner characterized as the result of the aging head of state becoming increasingly identified with the conservative orthodox Hindu element of the Congress party and his brooding on the decline of the ancient virtues of his country and seeing the innovative British as the reason for India's troubles. MacDonald issued a strong protest to the government of India after broadcast. This broadcast, Nehru gave a speech which in Donald's opinion went further than strict historical accuracy demanded in his references to the spontaneity of the mutiny and to the brave sons of freedom. But true to its assurances, the government of India largely downplayed the significance of the centenary. MacDonald lamented that in concession to the demands of Indian socialists, a number of British statues, particularly those of General John Nicholson and Alexander Taylor, who recaptured Delhi in September 1857, were removed by the government, though on the grounds that they might become lightning rods for disturbances. Local authorities removed other monuments. However, despite New Delhi's assurances to the British that they would not be touched, provincial governments, especially those in the northern areas, had suffered under the British reprisals to the mutiny, made a point of moving a number of British public monuments. The government of Uttar Pradesh, for instance, took down a large number of statues reminiscent of foreign domination and offensive to national sentiment in Lucknow, Kanpur, Allahabad and Agra. Still, for many in North India, the provincial governments were not proving iconoclastic enough. More than 400 protesters were arrested across Uttar Pradesh for demanding that all remaining statues and monuments of British rule be removed, and a number of unprotected British graves were desecrated in July and August. Moreover, counter monuments were also erected. In Meerut, a 100 feet tall white marble tower was erected as a memorial to the Indian martyrs of 1857. In Kanpur, as we have seen, the city government erected their statue of rebel leader Tatya Tope exactly on top of the old memorial wellhead. This clearly suggested that for nationalists, at least, the site's significance had not been obliterated by the removal of the statuary. The British community in Kanpur and the High Commissioner in New Delhi were also sensitive to the connotations and complained that the proposed disposition of the monument was offensive to British feeling. In this particular case, the terms of the transfer of the park to the city provided the British community with the means to stop the reappropriation of the site by claiming that the erection of the Tope statue was contrary to the terms of the deed of gift by which the memorial site within the gardens had been handed over to the civic authorities in 1949. Accordingly, the Kanpur municipal authorities moved the plinth of the new statue to another part of the gardens, although it still overlooked the former wellhead site. In West Bengal, statues to figures such as Sir James Outram in Calcutta were also taken down. An individual tried to blow up the statue of Sir Thomas Munro but was caught and imprisoned for a year. In other cities, Indian police guarded British monuments from the demonstrators, and a statue of Queen Victoria was broken by a socialist-led demonstration in southern India, where there had been little unrest during the events of the mutiny. The centenary nonetheless produced a number of attempts to find counter heroes to the British for commemoration, the individuals who had resisted foreign rule, but this was largely the result of domestic struggles between the Communist and the Congress parties, who proposed quite different Indian figures for statues, neither of whom were connected to the rebellion of 1857 to 1858. Indian nationalist iconoclasm continued after 1957. By 1964, 8 of 13 statues in front of government buildings on the central vista of New Delhi had been removed, though not destroyed. Protesters broke part of the face of the statue of George V in 1965, and this monument was removed in 1968. By 1970, the capital city of India had been cleared of all statues of foreign rulers. Remarkably, however, the majority of British colonial statues and monuments remained untouched, and indeed can be seen on their original plinths or in the precincts of their former locations today. And many of the remaining British mutiny monuments also remain, some with their original British inscriptions still in place, but now appropriated to Indian national memory, usually by adding a tablet in English and Hindi that reinterprets the monument for the domestic Indian audience. Thus, the plaque on the British Mutiny Memorial in Delhi retains the British inscription, but an additional one above it rejoins. The enemy of the inscriptions on this monument were those who rose against colonial rule and fought bravely for national liberation in 1857. In memory of the heroism of those immortal martyrs for Indian freedom, this plaque was unveiled on the 25th, and in memory of the heroism of those immortal martyrs for Indian freedom. This plaque was unveiled on the 25th anniversary of the nation's attainment of freedom, 28 August 1972. Such nationalist readings of the events of 1857 to 1858 were more often applied to British monuments in the 1960s and 1970s, and were much less apparent to British officials during the 1957 centenary. Indeed, the English language Indian press was remarkably restrained in its editorial comments during the centenary, and MacDonald agreed that there was a little at which the British could take exception. The National Herald of Lucknow suggested that the centenary provided a test of historical perspective. The revolt marked the end of the period of British expansion and the beginning of a new phase. The Times of India explained the background to the mutiny and concluded that divisions among the Sepoys and Indian people themselves were the cause of its failure. An editorial in the paper suggested that the revolt inspired the freedom movement that had led to the establishment of the Congress Party. The New Delhi statesman emphasized the friendliness in Indian British relations since independence. The Express lowered the tone in the opinion of MacDonald by suggesting that the heroes of 1857 had been betrayed by Pakistan's current dependence on the USA. The Illustrated Weekly of India reported that a sense of history was weak amongst the Indian people. There had been no national feeling in 1857. It suggested and little interest was shown in the centenary. Now the Communist New Age and the Brits, however, deplored the government's decision to play down the centenary by deferring celebrations until August. One American writer in India during the celebration did draw attention to the large amount of nationalist propaganda about 1857 in films, museum exhibitions, popular stories and journalism, but wrote that on the whole the documentaries were surprisingly fair-minded towards the British. Similarly, MacDonald thought the official history produced for the centenary by Sen was largely objective. His final comments on the celebrations, though inflected with the expected class bias for the High Commission, only the official Indian attitude and the middle-class English language press mattered were that they have revealed on the whole amongst educated Indians a well majority of judgment on the days of British rule. The mutiny generated much hatred. It is satisfactory that so little seems to remain. Conclusions. Sites of memory and the Raj. Iconoclasm of the 1957 centenary thus proved to be more limited than British officials feared, but there was still considerable debate within India about the fate of British monuments prior to and during the celebrations, and in the decades after 1957 a significant number of monuments were removed or appropriated to the needs of Indian nationalism. While British officials were concerned about mutiny and other large monuments between 1947 and 1957 centered on the question of British prestige and Commonwealth relations rather than nostalgia for past glory. For many within the British Indian community, both those who stayed in India and those who returned to Britain, the desire to protect the memory of British accomplishments, heroes and martyrs of the Raj remained strong. The Kanpur Memorial, well as one of the best known of British monuments in India, was certainly believed by the British Indian community to be a potential target for nationalist iconoclasts. It was intended to mark the memory of martyrs to the imperial project as both a tomb and a monument of British trauma for British consumption. For this reason, it was particularly important to the British community that it not be defaced, desecrated or appropriated for another political purpose. However, the memorial was also clearly a political statement about the British imperial presence and a highly didactic feature of the imperial project. The well was a reminder to its visitors of the failure of British Indian manhood to fulfill its most basic duty, the protection of women from the treachery of its colonial subjects, in order to ensure that it never happened again. For most of its existence, the message was conveyed not by the symbolism of the actual monument per se. The angel was really rather an Anodyne, 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 and commonplace funerary sculpture, but by the racial exclusivity of the site and the dominant mutiny narrative script that provided visitors with the meaning of the site. Given that this monument was such a declaration of British triumph through sacrifice, it is no wonder that the remaining British community in India and officials in the High Commission and in Whitehall feared that the site would become the target of Indian nationalist anger. After all, tearing down old and erecting new monuments is a way of taking vengeance on the past and attempting to create new understandings of history. The effacement of the actual wellhead by the British was thus meant to control the site's meaning in perpetuity, to prevent any attempt to re-inscribe this material site of memory with any other meaning. The British were right to be concerned that this might be attempted, as the erection of the monument of Tatya Tope overlooking the former wellhead in 1957 demonstrated. But even before Indian independence, the meaning of this site of remembrance had subtly changed by the very practice of paying homage to it. Initially, British visitors had come to Kanpur to pay their respects to the martyrs of the Raj, not to gape at Marochetti's artisanship. The object of veneration was the sport of the mask, not the architecture that now surrounded the graves of those killed. Yet, as is the way with tourism and perhaps even pilgrimage, over time the sign marking the site of memory, the angel statue, became the object of tourist interest. The mutiny narrative provided the framework for the meaning of the site, and the monument served as the visual prompt to this remembrance. But by the turn of the 20th century, the angel statue itself had become one of the most recognizable images of the Raj, reproduced in countless travel books and histories. As Steggles notes, with perhaps only a little exaggeration, the angel was probably the best known for the British was probably the best known of the British sculptures exported to the empire, and could well be the icon of British India, surpassing its symbolic content to the figures of the Queen. While the thoughts of the pilgrims and tourists may have been drawn to the memory of the women and children thrown into the well in 1957, it was indeed the angel that drew their gaze, and the angel on which most visitors chose to comment. It is for this reason that the angel was protected. It is for this reason that the angel was protected from potential desecration by moving it to the church after independence. By the actual site of remembrance, the tomb of those sacrificed in the name of the Raj was entirely obliterated. But once the angel had been removed, this signifier of the memory of the British rule in India, sacrifice, duty, fortitude, and above all, ultimate triumph over those who had threatened what Bernard Cohen had described as properly constituted authority and order, arguably became merely a marketable curiosity in a crumbling historic churchyard. The monument lost its political relevance. The monument of the British turned power over to their former subjects, no longer a bit signified of the collective memory of the British Indian community. The angel was as a fest of meaning as were the physical features of the site on which it had sat for 80 years. Thus, except perhaps for the remnants of the surviving British Indian community and their descendants who indulged in Raj nostalgia, the Kanpur well ceased to exist as a site of memory. It was not the effacing of the physical site and the moving of the angel that accomplished this, but rather the collapse of the relevance of the mutiny narrative in post-independence India and in post-colonial Britain. Only the distant relatives of those who died at Kanpur in the events of 1857 could thereafter find real significance in this unmarked grave site. While researching this book on the events at Kanpur in 1857, Andrew Ward traveled to Kanpur in 1994. Visiting Nana Rao Park, Ward asked one of the schoolboys playing cricket nearby in an empty fountain basin if he knew what had happened here almost a century and a half ago. He did not. His, he said and listened politely as I told him of the massacre at the baby girl. Quite impossible, he said, gazing at the sandstone slab beneath us. The British would never have buried their dead so carelessly. Namaskar. Dhanyavad. Thank you so much.